All right. Well, I think we're at 1 o'clock, and we'll probably have some handful of others trickle in as we get going. But we do have a lot we want to cover, so I want us to go ahead and kind of jump in. I want to thank those of you that have jumped on and are a part of this conversation with Dylan and Dan and myself. I am Ben Tindall. I'm the executive director for our organization, Save Family Farming. If Safe Family Farming, many of you, if you're a part of this, you're familiar with the organization, but we're a communications and advocacy organization really working to educate and provide outreach and advocacy opportunities for both farming community, but really targeting in particular the non-farming community and trying to kind of bridge that gap between agriculture and the non-farming urban suburban public. And so that really is some of the things that we try and work through as far as through communications tools such as written and press releases and getting articles and op-eds in traditional media outlets, newspapers, web-based content as well. We have a blog on our website, savefamilyfarming.org. We also do some communication through radio, podcasting, video content. We just produced a documentary film this past year, Losing the Farm. We have another documentary film about halfway finished through production that'll be coming out hopefully early part of next year called Farming on the Brink. And so you can, again, check these things out on our website. So I just want to kind of give you a heads up. That's who we are and kind of where we're coming from. But I'll turn it over to our Director of Communications, Dillon Honcoop, who's going to kind of help spearhead some of the conversation, and he'll introduce Dan. So thanks everyone though for participating. We really do appreciate you taking some time and listening in on this conversation. Dillon, take it away.
And thanks so much, Ben. We know we have an issue coming here in Washington State. The question about unionization of farm workers. We currently don't have the kind of pathway in the farming community that other people may be familiar with in other industries. Via the NLRB, we don't have an equivalent of that for farm workers in the nation, and we don't have one in the state. They do in California, and that's what we're going to be learning about today. So they're talking, activists are talking, legislators are talking about adopting a similar act to what they have in California for unionization, to pave the way for farm workers to be unionized here in Washington. And so the question is, what does that mean? What's that going to mean for farms? What does that mean for farm workers, the very people who certainly this is already being proposed and promoted as something to help that community? Will it help that community? What is the truth? And so that's where I want to introduce a guy that I've had a few conversations with. We actually had a bit of a web conversation with him a few years ago, pre-pandemic, before we all got really used to Zoom. But we're having him back now that this situation has changed here in Washington. Dan Gerawan with the former Gerawan farming operation, and a lot to that story of even what happened to that farm. And we can get into that eventually as we talk today. But had Dan on my radio program, The Farming Show, a few weeks ago, talking about this issue. They have probably one of the most unbelievable stories of the truth about particularly the UFW, the United Farm Workers Union, as well as how an Ag Labor Relations Act actually plays out in state government when it's enacted, because that's what they have there in California. So I want to welcome Dan. Dan, just before we jump, because I want to jump right into kind of the upshot here before we even get into all the history, because it gets pretty complicated. But just real quick, Gerawan farming, stone fruit primarily.
Yeah, we were stone fruit primarily. We were also very large in table grapes. Got out of table grapes at about 2016, I think. But we remained the largest stone fruit grower in the world for many years. Until I sold the company to private equity, that's a different story, but it no longer exists. But at the time of the UFW ALRB situation, we were the largest stone fruit grower in the world with several thousand employees.
Close to 5,000, correct?
At least, yes. There were times when table grapes were going, we would approach 10,000. So,
Wow. Okay. So as far as HR needs, as far as dealing with employees and union and yeah, you you've been there. You know this world
yes.
of big time farming, of big time producing food for the world to eat, which is what we talk about a lot. But just for people who are wondering, who is this guy, and what does he know? That's a lot of street cred right there, as far as the level at which you were operating and growing food. So let's dive straight into it. And I do want to get the whole backstory. What happened with your farm, particularly with this unionization issue. But just so we have a great takeaway for folks here in Washington right off the bat, United Farm Workers and other activist groups connected with them, like we were just talking about, are pushing for this change in Washington state law. They want to pave the way for unionization, collective bargaining on farms. After what you've been through there in California, what's the most important thing that you want us here and farmers here in Washington to understand? If someone takes nothing else away from this, what should people know? What should we know as we gear up to deal with this issue?
Well, number one, it's not collective bargaining. And number two, it's not organizing. It is forced unionization. And what they will be working towards, if not outright, depending on the components of the legislation, it's going to be forced unionization. And that's what we have in California. We've had forced unionization even before the recent card check legislation was passed. And this was all by design. It started here in California. It really in 1974 with Jerry Brown, was our governor twice. Jerry Brown 1.0 in 1974 passed the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, which was intended to bring peace in the fields, quote unquote, and create an NLRB type framework specifically for California ag labor. That was enacted. Union got a lot of contracts at the time. Then union pretty much died off. And then it was 2002 or three that they beefed up the Agricultural Labor Relations Act with another piece of legislation called MMC, and that stands for Mandatory Mediation and Conciliation, which is a misnomer. And the likelihood is that your legislation would have an MMC component. And that's simply, when it was passed here in California, the legislature was convinced that, well, this is a one-time drastic action, that if both sides can't come to a contract, we're making the assumption that if workers voted for the union, then they voted for having a contract. And if both sides can't make that happen, the government will step in and write the contract and impose it on the workers and employer as a drastic one-time action, but later the workers could decertify. Of course, then they passed legislation later to make it so the workers couldn't decertify. But the MMC was a huge step forward for them. So it was because of MMC probably that UFW decided to attack our company. We had lost a union election in 1992. We were a much smaller company at that time. I think there were 500 or fewer employees. We didn't even fight against the organizing effort at the time. So they won. But they never came to the bargaining table. They disappeared literally for 20 years. Then suddenly, after they had passed the MMC legislation, came back, told us that they were ready to bargain, that they represented all of our several thousand employees, even though 98% of them had ever voted for the UFW. Some had not been born yet when that election took place, but they had the legislation backing them up. Our ag labor attorney told us that the law was certified until decertified, and we had to go to the bargaining table, which we did. Then they also did this at a time when the volume of our workers was below 50% peak employment. So supposedly the workers couldn't do a decertification election. Nonetheless, they started the largest farm labor protests in California history, protesting not against us, the employer, and really not against the UFW, but against the ALRB, against the state of California for allowing the ALRB to be forced on them. They took to the streets. They shut down the streets in front of the courthouse many times. They went on strike. Even though it hurt us, they were going on strike to try to stop a government-written contract from being forced on them, a contract that would have lowered their wages, a contract that would have stripped them from the right to continue protesting in the streets like they had been, among many other things. They finally achieved a decertification election. And then the ALRB, though they ran the election themselves, then impounded the ballots and wanted those ballots destroyed. They never wanted the Latino immigrant farm workers to have the same choice that every other worker has to decertify a union. Now, let me reflect on what we were. You mentioned HR. We were the highest paying employer in the industry, at least $1 more per hour than any of our competitors. We had a very close working relationship with our employees. We paid for their children to go to private school if they wish to go to private school. We had vacation time, retirement pay. We had a lot of special things. I speak fluent Spanish. They knew us as people. So we were really in the ideal union avoidance situation. But again, this isn't about union. This isn't about organizing. This is about using legislation and regulation to force a union on workers, to allow them to pick the pockets of those workers who won't do it voluntarily. And long story short, after years and millions of dollars spent by us and many more millions of tax dollars spent trying to destroy those ballots, an appeals court stepped in, ordered the ballots counted, and I think it was 6-1. The union was thrown out, and that almost ended everything. But I won't go into the details that happened after that, not important. But it was quite the ordeal. And if you've got this kind of legislation coming to your state, you need to be very careful.
Well, it's good to know some of the.
Quick, just
Yeah, go
real
ahead,
fast,
Ben.
Dylan, if I could, just real quick, I've neglected to share earlier, and Dan, thank you for that those remarks. I did want to let our attendees, our participants know there will be a question and answer period at the end after our visit and after we have the conversation between Dylan and Dan. And I apologize for not mentioning that earlier, but at the bottom, I know we're all Zoom experts, but at the bottom, there is a Q&A tab. And I want to encourage you, if you do have any questions, as you're listening to Dan, if you have any questions and would like some additional information, use that Q&A tab and type in your question. And then in a handful of minutes after Dylan and Dan have had a time to converse, I'll help, and Dylan and I will help mediate some Q&A with Dan as well and facilitate those questions. So please feel free, use those that Q&A tab at the bottom. All right, take it away, Dylan.
Also, I don't know if we mentioned earlier this conversation is being recorded, and that way we can share it with more folks who weren't able to, with their schedules, be attending right now today. But to back to our conversation with Dan, this is already more information than I think a lot of us have about how an Ag Labor Relations Act might work here in Washington, to see what's happening in California and to understand ideas and concepts like this MMC. That was something that I didn't know about, the mandatory mediation and conciliation or whatever, to read. And you provided a great document that hopefully we can share with folks later, Ben, kind of a timeline of everything that happened with your farm, Dan, and the UFW and the ALRB and what your employees did. Fascinating story in that, just seeing how this MMC idea, which appears to be unconstitutional, and that's what you've challenged it on. And I went all the way to whether the Supreme Court would hear it or not. They did not make a decision on that, or have not. But if that were in a Washington state law, to understand what that would mean, I mean, it sounds like, well, that's a pretty strong statement, forcing unionization on folks. That's exactly what it does. As I read what played out with Gerawan farming,
It does.
They basically said, well, there's a complaint. What were they accusing you of, not bargaining in good faith, which whether they had the basis to do that or not,
right.
Sounds like
and unfair labor practice charges. Okay, first of all, when our labor attorney first told us about those, I said, well, that's easy. We just won't do anything. He says, no, you don't understand. they create unfair labor practice charges, and then the ALRB upholds them. So you're going to have ULPs, whether you like it or not, and you're going to be found guilty of them, whether you're guilty or not. And MMC, again, when it was first passed by the legislature, they were told, look, this is a one-time drastic action, nothing to see here. Well, then they quietly slipped in more legislation later that said, if an employer is ever found guilty of an unfair labor practice charge, then MMC can be used again. So essentially, you've got perpetual MMC, during which employees are prohibited from ousting the union. They cannot decertify the union. So right there, you have perpetual forced unionization, and that's totally by design. That existed in California before card check.
I mean, everyone's scared already of the idea of collective bargaining and how would that even go? But that takes it a step beyond it, where the government sets the contract for how the workers are paid.
Dylan, there's no collective bargaining. That's a joke. That doesn't exist. Under the ALRB, there is no collective bargaining. It's not unionization. We're not talking about unionization at all here. We're talking about forced unionization, and that's completely different. This is not the NLRB. This is, in California at least, an ALRB is staffed mostly by ex-UFW supporters, if not UFW employees. They are all far left, pro-union. They do not care about the facts. We went through a several month trial during which facts did not matter at all. It's all based on making sure that the union gets some type of contract. And whatever legislation is going to be put in your state under whatever guise, and whatever legislators, even if they believe what they're told, it's not what you're being told. UFW cannot organize. These farm labor unions cannot organize. They're looking for legislation to help hand them contracts, period.
So what should we be looking for here in Washington State? What should we be pushing on right away as these folks even try to put this together and push this on through the legislature?
Well, number one, I'm not going to talk a lot about union avoidance. I think there are a lot of consultants and people know how to make sure that their company has good labor relations and that they're avoiding unions. If you're doing all of those things, then the rest, first of all, you mentioned that if there is no way currently for farm workers to organize in your state, then I have to say, that's going to be a problem opposing legislation that allows that, because I think it's going to be, and I know a lot of you probably don't want to hear this, it's not going to be easy to go against legislation if that's at the core of it, because there are a lot of credible arguments that are made that farm workers should have the same right that others have to organize. When we went through our decertification election on our farm, we never campaigned against the union. When I went out to give speeches to our workers, I would always, all I would do, Dylan, all I would do would tell them the story of our company, tell them about my dad who was still in the company and working, tell them what we did to succeed. And that was it. I simply told the story because I didn't want to influence their vote in any way other than they knew who we were. They knew we were a family farm. They knew they were treated well. They would often during these speeches say that they were going to vote for the company or they were going to vote against the union. I would immediately say, you vote however you want to vote, and I'm here to defend your right to choose. And I will stop anyone who tries to take that right to choose, which is what the ALRB type legislation and the do-gooders are going to try to do. They don't want farm workers to choose. So I think right off, it's going to be important that your industry reposition itself as the defender of farm workers, which your PR people will tell you can't do. And your ag groups will tell you can't do. Well, if you don't do it, no one else is. And you're the most credible, probably most effective way to defend farm worker rights, because your legislature, your government won't, and nor will any farm workers union.
Talk a little bit more about that. You took kind of a maverick approach to communicating publicly about your situation. Talk about how you started, who you'd worked with, and you ended up firing some PR groups, right?
Right.
How did that all go down?
When we were first attacked, we went the standard route. We had a very excellent farm labor attorney. And because the attack was so high profile, and it affects our relationship with retailers. Obviously, when you're attacked by UFW, they're going to retailers and putting pressure, whether direct or indirect, for those retailers not to buy your product. So we fought back. I hired multiple top PR people, fired them all. Every time we were hit with something, some fake news, the PR people would say, look, your best bet is to say nothing. You're the employer. You already considered the bad guy. Let the industry associations do this, or let someone else do this. Do nothing. I finally got fed up and realized this wasn't going to happen. I did it myself, and I started communicating in defending our workers. As far as I'm concerned, they voted for us when they came to work for us. No one was defending their right to choose. So I defended them not for them to be anti-union, but rather simply to have the choice, simply to have the same rights that every other worker has. And I think that is what gave us the upper hand with the public and everyone else. I never, whether I was on a radio interview or anywhere else, I made it very clear I was not anti-union. I was pro-worker choice, and I was against any government agency trying to strip them of their rights, because the argument isn't with the UFW. They are inept. They are dishonest, more than any of you could ever understand. Whatever their leader is telling your legislators is mostly lies. And that's to be expected. What I was against was the state of California and the ALRB from not protecting our workers' rights, because that's what they were supposed to do. And when they abdicated that responsibility, I was the last choice.
So it sounds like, again, it's not going to be a winning position to say, well, we don't want workers to have the right to unionize, but it's going to take us as a farming community and the farm worker community understanding what's in the legislation that they're going to try to pass, and be able to communicate effectively how that's not in the workers' best interest, and it's not the kind of unionization that people are familiar with via the NLRB.
Exactly. In my opinion, it would be a losing battle to try to say they shouldn't have the right to organize. We've all got opinions on that, but the reality is I think that would be a losing battle. And I think it would be very important to take the high road and instead defend worker rights. Acquiesce on that, but then make sure the legislation, if there is any, has ways in it to protect the workers' secret ballot right. Make it so a contract cannot be forced on workers without them voting on it. Make it so a contract has to be negotiated. MMC is evil. It's wrong. A non-negotiated government-written contract forced on workers is immoral. And you, as the industry, need to take the high road and be the champion of these things. You also got to be careful that industry associations, they're the spear. I get that. They're the tip of the spear. They're supposed to do this stuff. They may or may not understand all this. A lot of them may think that they're going to be able to handle it through lobbying. A lot of them might think they're going to tell you, look, we can get a veto. Well, that didn't work out in California. Newsom signed card check because industry assumed they had a veto because they thought they had assurances from him. So you've got to fight hard, fight early, and not do anything quietly. If industry associations tell you to do it quietly because you're just not good with the public, because the public has a misperception already, and so just shut up and take it and let them handle it, be very, very wary of that.
You're speaking our language here at Save Family Farming, because we think the safest position is to operate publicly and to be in communication with that, particularly that urban public that the lawmakers care so much about, but often know very little about what's going on in the world of farming. Now, you just mentioned secret ballots, and a lot of people think about that with unions. Oh, the workers vote to bring a union in, and that had been the case earlier on in the state of California there with what you have. Then, as you just mentioned, you mentioned this idea of card check, and that changed that. So it's not about a secret ballot of workers voting to be in a union anymore, correct? And from what I understand, correct. That's what some here in Washington are already planning on proposing is a card check kind of thing. What is this whole card check thing?
Of course they are. And even if you keep it out of the initial legislation, in my opinion, you need to hard code into this legislation that it's never coming in. You need to hard code the protection of farm worker rights to a secret ballot, like Cesar Chavez wanted. Card check allows them to get the employees to sign something under the guise of whatever they want. And then they turn those cards into the ALRB, and the ALRB rubber stamps it and says you are hereby unionized. And that has already happened in California. And there were many workers protesting that they were tricked into signing those, of course. And you can't let that happen in the state of Washington. It's anti-worker. And even under the secret ballot on our farm, the night before the election, to the decertification election, the ALRB identified certain crews that UFW had told them were absolutely anti-union. And as these 600 workers approached the balloting area, they were literally herded aside, asked for 2 forms of IDs. Yes, these Latino immigrants were asked for 2 forms of IDs, and then interrogated, all in an attempt to intimidate them to turn around and go back and not vote. Those 600 ballots were impounded and never counted because they wouldn't have been outcome determinative to the election. But these are the kind of games that are played by these organizations. Do not ever assume that an ALRB is like an NLRB. It's not impartial in any way. And unquestionably, whatever they try to get into your state, they're going to pattern it after California's and try to make it as bad or worse.
If they do that, and it sounds like in California, right away, the UFW had its tentacles all throughout the actual state agency, the ALRB. How would we ever prevent that kind of corruption from happening if an Ag Labor Relations Act is passed here in Washington? How do we prevent that kind of corruption from happening with the inevitable state agency if this is passed and created?
Well, I mean, I guess look at the legislation. How are the board members assigned? Where do they come from? Who assigns them? It's the governor in California that assigns them. And, Jerry Brown 2.0 really wasn't bad. He actually vetoed some legislation that we had lobbied against and UFW lobbied hard for. He was careful about who was appointed to the ALRB, but now it's even worse. I mean, most of the ALRB board members have protested in favor of UFW. They've gone on UFW marches. They are ex-UFW employees. It is about as biased as you can imagine. So somehow in your legislation, try to make sure that for the sake of workers, not necessarily for the sake of farmers, but you're the protector of workers too, that there's something in that legislation to make sure that it is a fair and impartial board.
If you were a grower here in Washington right now and you knew this was coming down the pike, what would you be doing?
Well, first of all, are there any legislators or elected officials that are currently in support of it? If so, put them in your crosshairs. First, assume that maybe they don't know what they're doing, because they honestly probably don't, but then put them in your crosshairs. Let them know and the public know that what they're advocating is anti-worker, that it is in favor of stripping farm workers for the right of choice that everyone else has. But get the foothold on that before they do. That's what I would do immediately. And I don't know that farm labor groups are going to tell you to do that. They're going to say, just be quiet, sit back, don't do anything. Let's see what happens first. No, you don't have time. You need to be first in mind with the public when this legislation comes. You need to let them know that these groups, whether it's UFW, whoever it is, that they don't have the farm workers' best interests in mind, and show them what they've done in California and elsewhere, and dissect whatever they're proposing and let the public know and the legislators how that works.
Doesn't that just put a target on your back, though, to speak up like that, to kind of stick your head up out of the foxhole?
No, you've got a target on your back. Believe me, you've got a target on your back. And also, don't assume that legislators who are necessarily pro UFW are against you. I went to one legislative hearing where I got a vote in our favor, and those were primarily UFW supporting legislators on that committee. When they heard the truth, communicated directly with facts from the people affected, they will sometimes make the right choice, but they need political cover. Gavin Newsom needed political cover to veto card check. He wanted political cover to veto card check. No one should assume that crazy Gavin Newsom wanted card check. When Biden came out in support of card check in California, when Gavin Newsom found himself with zero political coverage because industry had taken the stance, sit back, be quiet, we've got a veto. That they didn't have a veto. The governor had no political cover. He had to do it. And so you need to give even the legislators who are pro UFW, give them political cover now to tell UFW to go away, to tell these groups that they are not going to be in favor of legislation that strips farm workers from the right to choose.
So it's all about focusing on the farm worker and what this means for them.
Yes, in my opinion, it is.
How do we make that believable? How do you push back against people who say, well, you say that you're trying to help farm workers, but this is just astroturf.
That goes back to standard union avoidance. Be a great employer to begin with. And don't advocate anything but worker choice. And then just speak the truth. That's all I did. And you know, I'm very confident we had the public on our side, a lot of whom would have otherwise probably supported UFW. When they heard the facts laid out so clearly, we had support.
Well, I don't know, it's crazy to see how this all played out in California, and this document that you shared with me just earlier today. And again, hopefully, Ben, we can make that available to folks who have attended this conversation today, so they can see the full timeline of what went on there at Gerawan Farming with this whole story. It's crazy to see the level of corruption, what really happens at the state government level, and it will send a chill down your spine if that's what is expected to happen here in Washington State. So we really have to take this seriously. And it does sound like there's a path forward. I know some folks, in talking about this, have felt kind of defeatist. Like, how do you argue against, workers being able to unionize, which is how it's even seen within the farming community among farmers itself. It was like, well, we can't take that position, but you are saying there is a different way, and the truth is different than that.
Well, again, I think you almost have to acquiesce on letting them have the right to organize, but maybe perhaps use that as an opportunity to have the legislation avoid what has happened in California. A good employer, the workers are not going to unionize. And so focus on being a good employer, focus on standard union avoidance practices, and that shouldn't be a huge worry. And use this as an opportunity to hard code into that legislation protections for farm workers and for farmers to make sure that what's happened in California can't happen there. That would be my advice.
So you had actually created a website to share information with farm workers.
Well, that website, so essentially we had two ways of communicating with our workers, which, one important one was all the workers would call in for their work schedule every day. So we started appending that with messages from me, spoken and fluent Spanish, letting them know what was going on. This was difficult because our ag labor attorney was basically saying, you can't do this, you can't do that. I said, look, I can't do anything, it seems like, but I'm going to tell my employees the truth. So I would record messages for them to hear, all of which centered around their right to choose. And that website that I had sent to you was simply a translation of those messages, all in English. So at the bottom of the flyers in Spanish, it said, if you don't speak Spanish, go to this website, public website. As you can see, it's still up. And you can see from those messages, everything I said was extremely direct, extremely factual. We never received one unfair labor practice charge for any of those messages because the UFW and ALRB knew that all I was doing was telling the truth. And all they would be doing by filing charges against us for that would be shining a light on that truth, which they didn't want to do. But those type of messages, again, are not something that an ag labor attorney is ever going to tell you to do. He'll probably advise you against it. I did it anyway. I did it because I knew that communication with our workers and the public was very important to winning the entire battle. And I would recommend that other farmers consider that too. Start up a system where they do call in to, well, it's all texting now. Well, whatever it is, append a certain message to it so that when you're attacked, you've established that you send messages to your employees and that you can tell them the truth if you want to. But those messages on that site were very effective, I think, for letting the workers know where we stood. We didn't tell them to think any which way, only that what was going on factually and that we continue to defend their right to choose and always would.
It sounds like in some way, we talk about this here at Save Family Farming. What's our focus on? How do we really win in a given situation? A lawyer's focus may be focused on winning in the courtroom, and you were just talking about that. But if you lose in the court of public opinion, that doesn't necessarily leave you in good stead. It looks like you had the opposite, where you were actually not directly losing, but getting roadblocks in the courtroom because of the machinations of the state agency and the things that they were doing, but you were at the same time getting wins in the court of public opinion, and that's what propelled the whole thing forward.
Yes, and we were actually doing very well in the courts also. Almost every time we went to court, the streets were shut down by protesting farm workers. It was surreal to be sitting in a courtroom with ALRB literally arguing to the judge that they want to impose on the workers protesting outside a contract that would lower their wages. The judge's hands are often tied by the law itself. So it took years for us to get into Fifth District Court of Appeals for those three judges to take matters into their hands and finally be the first adults in the room and put an end to it all. It took years and millions of dollars. And from a legal standpoint, we immediately hired out other attorneys who knew nothing about ag labor. We wanted to attack this on constitutional grounds, on any other grounds we possibly could. You've seen the audio clip of Professor Michael McConnell on that particular website. And I think a lot of that was very important because you cannot necessarily allow an ag labor attorney to handle all of this when there are so many constitutional issues involved and other issues. You have to think outside that ag labor law box, which we did, and that was really key to our success. Had we gone the traditional ag labor attorney route, we probably would have ended up with a contract. Who knows? We had to continue fighting and had to continue fighting with attorneys who were thinking outside the box. But that said, we had a great ag labor attorney too.
Very good information, and gives me a whole lot more ideas as far as understanding what's coming our way and understanding how we could potentially deal with it and push back against the problems that could be ahead here in the state. Ben, I know we were going to do some Q&A. I don't want to let us go too long before we get to some questions and kind of keep the conversation going here.
Perfect. Well, we do have some questions coming in. And I do want to encourage individuals, if there was any question that kind of got sparked during the discussion, please use that Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Just click on that, type in your question, and be able to President Dillon and I will be watching that. There was a question that came in that I do want to kind of reference. One that was asking for specifically Washington State, and so this is more Washington State focus. So I worked with, and I was texting a colleague Scott Dilly over at the Worker and Farm Labor Association. So I really appreciate them inputting on that. But the question was, in Washington State, for Washington State growers, is there anything, or what are maybe other Washington State growers doing to train supervisors or managers in what they can or cannot say to employees with regards to the question of unionization? And so I really appreciate Wafla's input. I was texting a little bit with Scott on that, but Scott mentioned that unfortunately right now there really isn't anything. There's nothing formally that exists as far as documentation or resources in that regard. But there was good advice to be, like Dan mentioned, responsive, to be respectful, to answer questions, to address things, head on. Don't avoid necessarily train managers because they really are the front lines in for most of the time in these conversations. There was a law passed here in Washington last year, Senate Bill 5778, employer political speech. It refers to employees do have the right to leave. They are not forced to listen to an employer's speech in a meeting on anything religious or political. And so they do have the right to avoid those meetings. They don't have to stay, but it is something over and over, and Scott mentioned it, to be positive, to directly address issues, involve the employees in that conversation, be responsive to concerns, because you may not get the second chance to address those. So address those head on. But there isn't anything necessarily formally developed. And so that is something that potentially some of our Washington State grower, potentially commodity groups or other associations may consider putting together. So I really
Ben,
appreciate that question.
Can I give a perspective on that? First of
Please,
all,
please,
everybody should ask
absolutely.
their own attorney what they should do. But it seems to me like it's wide open that employers now could start educating the workers. Another way we educated our workers was we had paycheck stubs and we printed a message on every paycheck stubs for many, many years. So when we went into the situation with the UFW, those paycheck stub messages simply morphed into that situation. But it seems to me that there's nothing wrong with your industry on an employer by employer basis or communications basis, a group of yours giving flyers or whatever to workers now saying, by the way, something might be coming. And what might be coming already happened in California, and it stripped farm workers of the right to choose. It tried to lower their wages with a government written contract that wasn't negotiated and that you won't even be able to vote on. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't start doing these things now. Again, industry associations and ag labor attorneys might say, don't be that lightning rod, don't do that. But farm growers have to decide on their own if this is coming. The sooner you get a foothold on that first in mind communication, the better. And I see no reason not to do that personally.
Back to the original question, I can see where it could be a little tough to say what you can or can't say because an Ag Labor Relations Act hasn't yet been developed or passed here in Washington State. But even when it is, Dan, I'm curious, like, how did you know what you could or couldn't do? Because normally I think, I would look to an attorney to say that. And you're saying the attorney was essentially saying, don't say anything,
Yes.
which wasn't helpful. You had things that you could say. How do you know? Do you have to read all the laws
first of
yourself?
all, even in California now, a lot could be said, probably more in your state. And so if I were an employer now and I wasn't under any sort of active organizing drive, I would be saying a lot. So I don't think there's anything stopping any Washington grower from telling workers what might be coming down the pike and why they should be fearful of it. In our situation, I remember walking when the decertification election had already been started. You're allowed to campaign and you're allowed to say anti-union things. I was literally walking to my first of many speeches with a crew of workers on the phone with my attorney saying, I need to know, what am I allowed to say? He wasn't even sure at that point, which is, and then I got off the phone and I said, I'm just going to tell a story. And that's all I did. And that's all I did over and over again. I felt, and I'm sort of glad it was that way because it showed that we were taking the high road in this insane situation. The workers didn't trust UFW. They didn't trust ALRB. I wanted to be the person standing in front of them that they could trust.
Well, and that brings up another question that, and I don't want to unfairly put something on you, but this question of what were your workers' opinion of UFW? Were you getting any feedback? Can you speak a little as far, I know that's not
Yes.
your personal
No,
perspective, but
I
from
could.
your
Okay, first of
experience,
all,
what have
first
they
of all,
informed
when
you?
when UFW attacks, they will put people into your fields weeks or months before, and they will try to poison the well, and they will also feed back information to UFW so they know which crews might be amenable to their message or not. But in general, our workers were clearly anti-UFW. I mean, they ousted it by a vote of 6-1, easy. And by taking to the streets by the thousands, it was very clear they were anti-UFW. When there were protests in the streets, UFW would then suddenly, I don't know where they would get these people, probably Skid Row for all I know, and send them out there, and there would be several hundred or even several thousand of anti-UFW, anti-LRB workers. On the other side of the street, there would be a dozen or so UFW people, including 2 or 3 employees, all of whom had been put into the fields weeks before as UFW employees. How do I know this? Because we have social media video of one of those employees at a UFW barbecue. And then days later, get this, it's going to be hard for you to understand. He filed an unfair labor practice charge against UFW for in an attempt to get the election that had already been thrown out put back into court, pried open, and then the vote thrown out. So my point being is they will stop at nothing to even if it's unethical. They used one of their own employees to file a ULP against them, the intent of which was to pry the election open and get it thrown out based on UFW's issues. They'll do anything, and the ALRB will go along with it. That's how extreme it gets. But in general, clearly, because we were such a good employer, we were paying high wages, we were doing everything right. We had the employees on our side. But the moral of that story is a lot of good it did us. If we were thrown into this nightmare situation anyway, we had the resources to fight it off. We never thought we were going to win, by the way. I didn't think we would, but we did. So that's why you have to make sure that whatever legislation is passed is pro-worker and pro-worker choice, because ours wasn't in California. Ours is not in California. And but to answer your question, to get the workers on your side, it's just be a good employer.
Now, that was the case at Gerawan, but I'm sure you've got connections all over the state. What's the sentiment among at least your sense of the sentiment among the farm worker community across California, their perspective on UFW and the ALRB?
Oh, they don't like it. And that's a problem also because there's so much strife that takes place during an attack like that they just don't want to work there. So you're going to have problems retaining workers and attracting workers when there's an active campaign on. They don't want to get in the middle of it. They don't want to be herded aside and asked for 2 forms of ID like the ALRB did on our farm. And that's by design. The ALRB and UFW want to bring you to your knees. And if more workers don't want to work here or more workers leave, that makes them happy. So again, avoid it. Moral of the story is stop this before it gets started.
I will insert. I know hopefully several of you have seen Dylan's conversation. It was several weeks back with another individual, Jesse Rojas, who spoke about the work that they have done from the farm worker, and he is a farm worker activist there in the California, and some of his experience. And so, yes, pairing that exactly with what Dan's sharing, but then talking with Jesse and hearing his perspective from his involvement with the farm workers. It really was a powerful conversation. So I want to encourage you to check that out. You can go to our website, look at that our podcast audio as well that Dylan had an interview with him recently. Well, one a question that we got that do want to field to you. I know you've mentioned it a little bit as well, Dan, but how can we really make a difference when you have the media and really you have what at least feels like a media and government kind of machine working working against you. How can we, as either just your average producers and employers, as groups like ourselves, how can we actually make a difference?
Number one, start early, start now. Don't let, when this legislation comes in or when it's proposed, you can be sure that UFW and other groups are going to have a communications machine. And you need to be first in mind. You need to let the public know now. You need to let so-called pro UFW legislators know now that it's not what they think it is. And just let the truth speak. Don't hide it. You don't need some PR hack trying to tell you how you should say it. It needs to be said directly and very clearly. Otherwise, the public's not going to get it. And I think you can get most of the public on your side, especially if it's in the terms of giving Latino immigrant farm workers the same rights that every other worker in this country has. There's no reason to deny them those rights. And that's exactly what pro-UFW legislators want to do. And make sure that those pro-UFW legislators get it too, that you're going to go after them. You're going to go into their districts and let their Latino immigrant farm workers know that they're trying to do something to strip them of the rights that everyone else has. Now, no ag labor attorney, no PR person, and certainly no ag association is going to tell you to do that. I'm telling you, you should if you want to win. We won.
Thinking about how that would go, how do you go out and send a message that we're about worker choice? These things that you've talked about, people are just going to assume that you're then promoting for the union, for unionization as an idea, because isn't there just kind of a default public understanding about how people think that works? And as you're explaining, that's not how the ALRA, the Ag Labor Relations Act, and all that has played out in California. That's not how it works there. But people assume that it is. If you go out with the message of saying we're about worker choice, well, then isn't that going to be assumed that you're in favor of the whole union scheme that they're trying to push?
I think that's why you need to reposition them before they position themselves. And you need to do it early. I think, the public isn't stupid. Farm workers aren't stupid. They understand that there's a difference between the right to organize and having something forced on them that they can't choose. And there have been enough instances of that in California where you can point to it. And you can point to UFW's membership, which I assume is still less than 1% of California farm workers. Why don't they have more? And if it were so good in California, then why aren't more companies organized? At this point, you could also point out to your farm workers that most of those companies that UFW have ever organized are gone now. These are things you can say early, and that you should say early, because when it gets to the point you can't say them, you're going to wish you did. But I think, again, just taking the high road, admitting, look, they don't have the right to organize now. Perhaps they should. Of course, as employers, we don't want to be organized, but we think our workers are not going to organize because we think they're treated well. But what we don't want to see is having them in a situation where they have a contract forced on them. It's going to hurt them. It's going to hurt us as employers. We have a crop to bring in. Most of the public understands that, I think.
When you were growing up, did you ever think that this would be, you grew up in the world of farming like I did. Did you ever think this was the kind of stuff that you would end up dealing with?
Interesting question, Dylan. The answer is yes. Because when I grew up, it was in the late 60s, early 70s, when there was a lot of this going on. When I would be going to school, grammar school a few miles away, and the roads would be closed because there was union violence in the fields. So I saw all that. And I watched it for years, and I knew it wasn't going away. They are playing the long game. When they come into your state with this legislation, and they say, look, there's nothing to see here. We're not going to have MMC. We're not going to have card check. This is simply giving them the right to organize. You have to draw the line there. because they're playing the long game. They know very well they'll be back in 2 or 3 or 4 years, and they will amend that legislation. So hard code into it now that workers will always have the right to choose. They cannot have a contract forced on them. They will always have the right to vote on a first contract. Hard code all those things in now. It's my advice.
Yeah. We're just about out of time. We did have one question, Ben. I don't know if we have time to have Dan get to this real briefly, just to summarize quickly what MMC is again, for folks to understand. I think people have heard of card check somewhat. It's not, I don't well understand it, but MMC is something that's fairly new to my understanding and very scary as well as card check.
And Dylan, I'll try to look for something in writing to send to you that you can circulate. Basically, again, MMC is mandatory mediation and conciliation. I'm not sure what industry it came from, but it did exist, and it was with certain labor contracts. But in this case, it's in California ag labor. And if the two sides can't come to an agreement and can't reach a contract, either side could petition the ALRB to hold MMC. ALRB then brings in an arbitrator, and he sits down, supposedly listens to both sides, and he writes a contract. He writes it. He decides on your wages. He decides on your working conditions. He decides whether your workers can continue protesting against the ALRB. And then this contract is forced on you and the workers against their will. You could be paying more than you're paying now, or you may even be paying less, as would have been in our case, than what the contract had said. But the union would then get its pockets lined from whatever percentage is taken out of their checks to give to the UFW.
So what's the biggest thing to push against? Is it card check? Is that the worst thing that we need to make sure isn't in this? Is MMC? Is there anything else?
I think both
as we wrap up here.
Yeah, I think both of those you need to push against them. And when you get this ALRB type legislation, it'll be interesting if you're pushing against these things to hear what the other side says. How are they going to argue against giving the workers the right to choose? They will. But your message needs to be louder, clearer, and more factual and backed up by the facts of what have happened in California.
Excellent. And what you're saying is very, very much in line with our values here at Save Family Farming, not just as far as speaking out and having a presence publicly, but as far as making this issue, labor issues, about the farm worker and telling the truth at all times, which our opponents often will play with not doing that.
True.
Well, with that, I will kind of wrap it up. We got a few minutes left. One, I'm looking at our Q&A. I think if there is any last minute, you're welcome to pop it in there. But I will say, Dan, thank you very much for taking this time with us. This means a great deal, as you are a handful of steps ahead of Washington State, and your experience is certainly something that we can learn from. Any last minute words or kind of bits of advice that you would like to throw in there, or any questions maybe that we should have asked that we just didn't think to because we don't know?
I think you covered it well. I'm glad to help. We'll be glad to continue helping. If anyone could learn from what we went through, I'm more than happy to help.
Perfect. Well, we will be putting out some information on this topic. We'll be putting out. We did record this webinar as well, and we will be making it available after the fact. And so, individuals, if you want to rewatch this, or we'll make it available to share and let others know. This is certainly a conversation that we'll be continuing, keeping on going. So, Dan, thank you. Dylan, as always, thank you for your leadership and helping coordinate this and put this together. I do want to let those of you that are on, please stay in touch with us. If you haven't checked out our website, please do so. We got a lot of information. We're putting out weekly content and weekly articles on our blog and through the news there, savefamilyfarming.org. And like I mentioned earlier, we have various outlets through written content, audio, podcast, radio, video, that we certainly want you to stay in touch. If you're not signed up for our newsletter, you can do that on there as well. We also have a phone to action campaign where we've got literally hundreds of individuals that have allowed us to be a part of them through text and sending out alerts and encouraging them to reach out to legislators or policymakers or individuals who are making rules or regulations that are impacting us. So I want to encourage you, if you're not signed up for one of those or both of those, I encourage you to do so, and you can do that through our website again, savefamilyfarming.org. And so I want to encourage you to do that. But with that, I will wrap it up. Dylan, is there any last closing thought from you before we do?
No, other than just to say thank you to everyone who was here, and especially thank you to Dan for being so willing to help us out.
Yes.
Thank you,
Dan,
Dylan. Thank you, Ben.
We appreciate you all. Enjoy your afternoon, and thanks for being a part, everyone.